Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, this heating planet, fast heating planet. I'll show you a graphic of that. And it's still wrapped in a pandemic, which is impeding all kinds of action on everything you can imagine, including solving the pandemic. There's still only about 13% of humanity fully vaccinated. 13%, that's like a little more than 1 billion out of the 7.8 billion people that are our neighbors. And vaccination is still a choice in many places. And, we live in free societies, mostly, hopefully. And that creates all kinds of issues and challenges. Today, well, I'll get back to that in some of these Sustain What webcasts and in my work in Bulletin, revkin.bulletin.com for sure. But today is about the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 33 years and ticking. And it was formed the same year I started writing about climate change, 1988. I'm posting a new piece about what's new and not new on my blog. I will call it a blog. It's a newsletter by some other estimations as we go forward. And some of the IPCC scientists are going to be with us this morning. I wanted to start to talk about how do you move from information to efficacy? This is a question that challenges journalists as well as scientists. Anyone whose job is essentially building knowledge has come up against some roadblocks and frustrations these last 30 something years on this issue. For some of my friends, actually more than 30, more like 40 or 45 years. And you see the information build, you see a new report out, and you keep putting out information. You try better graphics. You move from writing to film to podcasts, and still the world's burning, and still the emissions are rising. That's what we're going to discuss today. And again, a couple of scientists will be here shortly. I wanted to start with a little conversation I had a couple of days ago with the former chairman of the 5th assessment. The one that just came out is the 6th assessment. And I had a conversation with Jan-Pascal Ipserel, who is a Belgian climatologist, a planetologist actually, who has been examining these questions for nearly 50 years. And he was the chairman of the vice chair of the 5th assessment from the IPCC. And I had a discussion with him about maybe is it time to restructure this enterprise, which, as you might have heard this week, the report that just came out on Monday is just number one of a 3-part kind of a rhythm. It's the basic science, and then the impacts and adaptation and vulnerabilities, and then, which isn't until next year, early next year. And then in March of next year, the one on how do you slow warming? Mitigation is that funky term for cutting emissions or otherwise slowing warming of the planet. And we'll be discussing these questions in the next hour with scientists from those 3 domains. I see Paul Edwards is in the green room, getting up early out in California. And I'm just going to click you in here. Oh, that's funny. Why didn't I see you in the green room, but when I click here, that's the oddest thing. This has never happened. Oh, there you are. Can you hear me okay? Paul, can you hear me? It's a very slow connection for some reason. Paul, and actually, if anyone in the audience is having trouble hearing, let us know too. Hold on a second. Paul, are you hearing me? No? Let me go to the tape. Let me roll the tape as I said I would do a second ago. This is an IPCC author who was the vice chair of last year's IPCC. I mean, not last year's, the 2013 assessment, the 5th one. And here he is. Hold on a second while I do this. Still learning some of these StreamYard methods. Share video file. Hang with me, folks. This has been one of those weeks you can imagine. All right, so here's dependency and things like this. Once a process gets laid down, it seems very hard to change. The special reports have been different, but the process seems like a bad fit for the problem right now.
Yeah, when I campaigned to become the chair in 2015, the chair of IPCC, I mean, one of my proposals was to actually change the structure of the IPCC, and at least to have two working groups instead of three. One dealing with the diagnosis, and the other one dealing with the prescription. So the diagnosis would be not only about the state of the climate system and its possible evolution under different scenarios, but also would deal with the impacts associated to the changes in the physical system. Now, this report does a little more than past reports from Working Group 1 in the area of impacts, because it talks about those climate impact factors and the changes in the severity of those factors, and that will certainly help Working Group 2 when it's Working Group 2 will finalize its report in February next year. Having the best information about the impact, but it would be better if it was more integrated, and then one could have another working group looking in an integrated way again at the solution that would integrate adaptation and mitigation, because both are needed, and it would be much better actually to look at them in an integrated way rather than in separate and in silos.
What would have to happen? Like, would the countries have to vote on this for that change to be made? How does that?
Yes, it would be extremely difficult, because, as you said, once a structure exists and it's very hard to change. But still, I think it would be worth to look into the possibility of restructuring IPCC and also changing its way of working. Some of the way it's working. Look. Each time a new bureau is elected, new co-chairs are elected for a working group, it's usually rotates from one country to another. They have to restart from scratch, organizing a technical support unit, which is the secretariat they rely upon. And they have to hire new people. They have to try to understand how the previous team did it, etc. I mean, it takes a full year before those people are operational. If the next report need to inform the climate convention process, which has an ambition cycle which is now 5 years, it's written black on white in the Paris Agreement. How is it going to work? I mean, this report is published between 7 and 8 years after the previous one. If the assessment cycle needs to become again, because it was like that at the beginning of the IPCC, if it needs to become closer to 5 years to remain policy relevant, we need to change the way the IPCC is organized. We cannot start again from scratch at the beginning of every cycle.
Wow, pretty important points. Well, let's hope there's a way to figure. So that was recorded with Jean-Pascal on Sunday night, late Sunday. I was doing a lot of reporting for my the posts that I did for revkin.bulletin.com. And now here's Ed Carr from Clark University. Paul Edwards hopefully will be coming back in a minute. We had some technical issues. Ed, the last time I talked to you, I think it was about East African drought.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, I know. And can you just introduce yourself and explain what part of you interfaces with this thing called the Climate Panel?
Sure. So I'm a professor, and I'm the director of the International Development, Community, and Environment Department up here at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm also the Adaptation Panel member for the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel for the Global Environment Facility. And then, probably most relevant to this, I am a lead author for Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. Working Group 1 is the group that put out the report the other day. Our report is coming ideally in February, pretty COVID delayed, but we're working on it right now. So I'm part of the writing team for Working Group 2.
Now, quick, I just was wondering this about Working Group 2. Way back in the beginning, I've been on this beat since the 80s. When IPCC first launched, was it just impacts adaptation, or was the word vulnerability already there from the beginning?
That's a good question. I don't actually know, to be honest with you, because I started into this process relatively recently.
Right,
Vulnerability, however, given just the IPCC's long range arc, right? When it started through the 90s, even into the early 2000s, there wasn't tons of talk about adaptation yet, for a lot of reasons, including a real fear that major attention to adaptation would lower the impetus for action on mitigation.
Right.
And I think that, when we got into the early 2000s, mid 2000s, it became very, very clear that even with aggressive mitigation action, we were going to need adaptation work. And so at that point, concepts like vulnerability really start to rise within the IPCC. When it reached the level of like the official government sanctioned outlines, for example, I'm not sure, but it would have been around that time.
Now we have Paul back. Let me see if our connection is a little better. Paul, we had a little trouble earlier. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine. And sorry about the glitch.
It's okay. There is a long lag. It's like you're in the space shuttle. But we get you.
I am in the space shuttle. Okay.
If we're careful to sort of speak and then stop speaking, and it should work out. And so Paul, Ed Carr, who's a Working Group 2, and who I've known for a long time through his work on the full suite of drivers of vulnerability facing people in places like sub-Saharan Africa, was just explaining his role and the adaptation vulnerability impacts group. Can you just lay out very quickly the Working Group 1 mission?
Mm-hmm. I must have missed a word. Was there a question there? So you want to add
the mission of Working Group 1.
Yeah, so Working Group 1 is on the physical science of climate change. This time around in AR6, there was a much greater focus on integrating things that had previously been separated in the Working Group 1 report. So instead of, say, a chapter on paleoclimate, that appears in multiple chapters throughout the report. And also on moving from the global scale to the regional scale. And the unique thing about this report is really the interactive atlas. It's online, anyone can look at it. It breaks up the inhabited world into 45 regions and assesses the prospects for both the evidence of from the past about their what's happened to them so far in terms of heat, precipitation, and a few other factors, and then projects into the future what's likely to happen in those places. So I think this will be really useful for policymakers. I think in terms of what we might talk about on this broadcast, the key thing is the focus on the physical science. So there is some context setting in chapter 1 that describes the political context and a bit about the social and values context of this report, and also some about the history of climate science so far, but there is nearly nothing about policy or mitigation strategies or the other things that are covered in the other working groups.
Right, and that's kind of, before you joined, I was showing a clip of a conversation I had with the chair of the fifth assessment, the vice chair, I'm sorry, Jean Pascal, and he was laying out a pretty cogent argument for, I won't call it the brokenness, but the awkwardness, the inutility of having these time gaps and having the adaptation options and mitigation options come really here almost a year after the basic science. For the news reporters and the policymakers, of course, you want to have a coherent picture, right? You want to have an understanding of the foundation under the choices, but to have them strung out, then you lose all the moment that comes with that package. And it just feels to me as a journalist that it's, and this is not just me, Jan Pascal, when he was running to be the chair of this sixth assessment, he said he had actually ran on pushing hard to change the structure. Now, of course, it's not up to the scientists, right? It's up to the countries that shape this process to determine if they're going to change that. So, Paul, I've muted you just for a second because there was some background sound, and I'm going to unmute you in a second. And so if you have a thought there, and then Ed will get to you. And Dana Fisher, who's a Working Group 3 contributor, will be with us shortly. She's at the dentist, but coming back to be on the show. So anyway, Paul, over to you. If we do have a long lag here, but I think it should work out.
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on, but yeah, I completely agree that it would be much better. I mean, in the buzz about the Working Group 1 report that I've seen in the last couple of days, there have been a lot of people asking, well, what should we do? And that's just not really covered in Working Group 1. I mean, it is there implicitly because we have the scenarios that, from a very low to a very high emission scenarios and predict what will happen under each of those scenarios. But there's nothing there about a particular direction for policy or strategies. Just, here's the situation and here are the emissions reductions it would take to reach these various temperature goals. So one of the things I've found as an author is that there's tremendous reluctance in Working Group 1 to say anything that might be construed as policy prescriptive. And that phrase comes up a lot, and it is interpreted very broadly. So really anything that mentions policy is seen as potentially suspect and not something that we would want to cover.
So Ed, I know, again, because you're on the ground, my friends who are climate modelers are all great, and they're doing incredibly hard work year by year to refine models. And my friends who are environmental economists are doing amazing work. But the friends and sources I've spoken with over the decades who are in the trenches, in places that are getting flooded, in places where poverty or prejudice are pushing people to the edges of habitability, way faster than climate is changing, they're feeling they're not getting through, their message is not getting through. How urgent is it to tip the conversation a little bit differently?
It's an excellent question. I think, and I want to link this to what Paul was just saying. It's a really urgent conversation. But there's a question of what the right venue for that conversation is, and that's where the IPCC runs into challenges. I mean, as Paul pointed out, none of the working groups, even the one that has sort of policy in its title, we're not positioned to be policy prescriptive. We are an assessment of the knowledge that is out there, right? And so we're supposed to lay out what we know from what people have already done. And the other thing is, as a former policy advisor back in the day at USAID, the worst thing you can do is be policy prescriptive as a member of our community, because policymakers like to make decisions. They don't want to be told what their decisions are. They like to make them. So you have to lay out the evidence and the options. And this is why scenarios are effective, because you can show people sort of future pathways and go, do you like that path? Because if you don't like that path, this is the decisions that get you on that. If you like this path, here are the decisions that get you on that path. And then you're not making a policy decision, you're letting someone make those decisions. But that said, to your question, Andy, and I think what I heard Paul saying a second ago, yeah, on one hand, it's wonderful, the attention that the Working Group 1 report is getting. But the problem with the staggering of these reports, on one hand, we need Working Group 1 to finish, because how can Working Group 2, which thinks about vulnerability and adaptation and all that kind of thing, if we don't know what the statements on the physical science are, it's hard for us to come to our final conclusions. But it kind of reinforces this idea that climate change vulnerability is driven by exposure. That is, like, the changes that are so well recorded by Working Group 1, and in a more refined way this time around. I think there are a lot of important refinements. That's incredibly critical for understanding the challenges we face, but it's one piece of the challenges we face. And in fact, vulnerability has three parts. It has exposure, which is tremendously important, but then it has sensitivity. So whether or not you or something you do is actually sensitive to that change. So you can be exposed to precipitation change, but if that precipitation change is 1 centimeter per year over 20 years, you're probably not sensitive to it. And then the question is, do you have adaptive capacity? So there is a big change going on, but the United States, for example, in terms of agriculture, whether or not we're sustainable over the long term, we have enormous amounts of resource and infrastructure and are capable of throwing more of that at our agriculture, thus continuing to farm things that in other parts of the world maybe could not continue because they lack that kind of adaptive capacity. So I think that the job of the later working groups, especially Working Group 2, is to really start to get at that wider frame of vulnerability, to build on the really good work of Working Group 1 and take it into this bigger conversation that you're talking about, Andy.
And Paul, you have a very special perspective, because if I understand it correctly, you're one of maybe only 2 social scientists in Working Group 1. Is that accurate, or within an order of magnitude? Are there, of the 300 or so scientists, how many are social scientists? Paul, you're muted.
Yeah, you're breaking up a lot, but I think you were asking about the social science role in Working Group 1 and the fact that I'm one of a tiny handful, maybe only 2. I'm not entirely sure. But, my role in Working Group 1, my big climate book was about the history of climate models and data and how they interact. And that's what led me in there. And also the fact that I've been hanging around this community for 30 years. So people know me, and there's a certain amount of reputation value that helps with this kind of thing. But I found that I was readily accepted and actually viewed as an important contributor to the report. So I did not have there was no sort of prejudice against social scientists that I found. And really working on the history section of Chapter 1 was such a pleasure, because there are so many people in Working Group 1 who know about the history of their narrow discipline, and I don't know all that. So there's so much to know, and it really helped to have all those comments to build that out and make it more robust. But for thinking about the report as a whole and sort of what it does, I think there are definitely aspects, and some of these were called out in our Twitter thread yesterday about whether we can say things, for example, about the role of fossil fuel lobbies in creating the situation that we're in now, which are just a matter of historical fact at this point. There's no real question about any of that, and they will actually even admit it. So that was resisted because it is seen as a kind of direct attack on a sector. And there's a way in which I think that position is right, because if you're seen as having a chip on the shoulder, a grudge against a particular group or sector, that's going to reduce your audience and provide ammunition for people who want to undermine the entire report. But I do think, go ahead, Andy.
Sorry. No, this is an important point in so many ways. The other aspect of focusing on drivers of emissions is that can then cause a lack of discussion of the other grotesque drivers of emission, of vulnerability, meaning emissions is only one source of vulnerability. So it's like in Chapter 1 of a story, if you identify one factor, and one consequence, there's no narrative, because then you get to the second chapter and people like Carr will be saying the main reason people are dying in floods is because societal forces are moving many people who don't have a choice into floodable zones. And then the third chapter historically has always been about mitigation. It is about slowing warming as opposed to solving the problem. And the problem is risk, unless I've got it wrong, and not necessarily warming. So it feels like a tangle to me still. And I hope there's a way forward. I think, by the way, maybe Paul, you could talk about the climate impact drivers chapter, which is a new part of the first section, because it might seem to be like a bridging thing.
Yes, it's definitely a bridging thing, and that's part of where it came from. And we, it's discussions with Working Group 2 that led us into that, and discussions about risk in general throughout the whole report. And we started off with the idea that there would be a single unifying risk framework that the whole report would use. And it didn't quite work out like that, but the climatic impact drivers idea did come to us from the other working groups and the risk working group that across them. So, the idea of a climatic impact driver is that you have these physical effects of climate change, heavy precipitation and so on, that are dangerous if you're in the right place at the right time, and if you don't have protection against it. But some places people will not be affected much by those same events, and others might even benefit. So we can't really say that the fact of more heavy precipitation by itself means that any particular place will suffer from that. They might even have might fill their reservoirs and not bother them too much. So that's the concept of the climatic impact driver. It's kind of an awkward word. We used to use the word hazard, physical hazard, but the point that was made, and quite correctly, is that it isn't always a hazard, and that depends on, again, where you are and what your protection from that condition might be like.
You reminded me of a paper I just was looking at when I was dealing with all the flooding in Europe. I'm trying to find it right now. It was a paper showing across Europe, there are places where flooding is rising and falling, and in ways that are logically integrated with what's known about climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, keep going.
No, and the discussion here in California about wildfire risk is an interesting one, because it's definitely driven by drier soils and less rain, but it's also affected by how we manage forests and the fact that we've had 100 years of federal policy to put out the fires and not let them burn in an ecosystem that's basically driven by fire. So there's both of those things play into the amount of risk that we face, and we can't, we can separate them to some degree, but we have to think about all aspects of it when we're thinking about how to manage it.
So Ed, that takes me back to your realm again, and I know Dana Fisher should be here soon, which is the one other big thing that seems distinct about the vulnerability and exposure part is that's where climate impacts are all local. Mm-hmm. Sea level rise, of course, is this global driver on ice sheets, which is going to progressively, as the report says, for centuries and even millennia, create disruptive change on coastlines. But again, everything else is local. Communities' capacity to evacuate, as Bangladesh has shown, there's huge potential to cut mortality in an area of implicit cyclone risk. So what do you do at the global level? I mean, Ed, you don't want to spill the beans on specifics of the Working Group 2, obviously, but there's some general principles here that already have emerged. So what comes to mind as a way, is there an adequate understanding of what globally can be done to facilitate local adaptive capacity, for example?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that it really depends on who you ask. I think is the answer there. There is a rising movement towards sort of community-based adaptation and locally based adaptation work to empower communities and individuals where they are. One of the hallmarks, I think, of my work has been a long-standing argument that we have to stop acting like communities that we think of as vulnerable have an absence of resilience or an absence of adaptive capacity. In fact, people are always adapting. One of the things that makes me craziest in the world is when I see, and it's usually in the popular media, occasionally shows up though in scientific journals, where you see a modeler talking about a long-term climate trend, say in Southern Africa, and they say, well, this means that maize won't be cultivatable there in 20 years, so 50 million people will be food insecure, which sort of implies that the farmers are just going to sit there pounding away at a crop that is progressively failing until they keel over dead, which of course isn't how farmers behave in any way. Right. Farmers have all kinds of ways of adapting to things. Now, can they adapt fast enough? Will they adapt adequately? I think that those are all kinds of interesting questions. And so to answer those questions, no, I don't know that we have an appropriate level of global information on that. I think we have lots and lots of local cases and local data that exists, that has shown up in the literature and is getting scaled up. But in terms of whether or not that knowledge that, say, farmers have in a particular place is getting linked to an adaptation donor organization that's trying to think about what needs to get funded where, no, I don't think that we do have adequate connection yet. And I don't know that that's been prioritized. And I think one of the things we're starting to see, and it was interesting to hear Paul talk about social science being accepted into this. I've also seen this over time in some of the areas I work in. The need for more and more social science to actually do something about this challenge. I think we're going to start seeing a shift in the conversation, which is, not, yes, we got to keep funding models. Yes, we have to fund basic research in the physical science of climate change and the natural science of climate change. We're going to put a pile of money into the social science of climate change. And not just, by the way, funding people like me. We're going to need to start building capacity in these countries, in their universities. We're going to have to start empowering people with funds in these places to do this research, because it's far too large a challenge and there's far too much data that we need right now. So I think that there's a big, big challenge there, and it's not going to get solved in this top-down kind of way.
And boy, talk about perfect timing. Here's Dana Fisher.
Hello, I have clean teeth.
That's so great. I can't believe you're able to get to the dentist and back in an hour. But anyway, here we go. Dana is a social scientist and who's contributing to Working Group 3, which is, again, mitigating climate change. But I know you have a lot of experience, not just on this general issue of the social landscape. How do you create capacity from the top, theoretically, like from a Paris Agreement, or even within a country, federal initiatives that can actually have meaning where it's most needed? But Dana, so anyway, just tell people who you are. You're at University of Maryland, and let's get you into the mix here.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm Dana Fisher. I'm a sociologist and a sociology professor at the University of Maryland. I run the program for society and the environment there. I'm also a contributing author to Working Group 3 in Chapter 13. Yay, Chapter 13, which is, but I was specifically tasked with coming in to add a new section looking specifically at civic engagement and the role of activism. And what's, I think, really interesting here is there's so much discussion right now about these bottom-up efforts to pressure policymakers at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, at the international level. I've actually been studying the role of civil society at these multi-levels since the 1990s through the Kyoto process. And one of the things that the IPCC asked me to do, which I found really challenging, was to measure the carbon impact of activism and engagement, which is something, yeah, I know. And I was like, as a social scientist, we think about this from, as a social scientist, we think about it completely differently than when I'm in the climate world and talking the climate world. And everybody's like, oh, it's great. Go pressure, go lobby, go bird dog. But what does it actually mean for climate? And so basically, I wrote this really long thing that ended up in Wire's Climate Change. And they made me cut most of it because it didn't actually have any relationship whatsoever to actual climate, in terms of carbon or any greenhouse gas, right? So I then went looking for all this, for the research that exists that helps us to think through what does it actually mean for carbon if you write a letter to an elected official or you participate in a protest. And so that's something that's, driving a lot of my work right now. I'm actually starting a new project looking at the emergent civilian climate corps, where we actually are hopefully I'm going to work with folks as this program gets kicks off to actually measure what are the effects in terms of, there it is, in terms of work in a corps to address climate change, right? If we put up 3 solar panels, what does it mean? If people plant trees, what does it mean? So those are the kinds of questions that I've been struggling with for the past few years.
Wow. But I guess it's encouraging to know that that's getting into the IPCC mix. It's also, to me, the reason I went, wow, is because I know that, as I've said this before, and it reminds me of a line from that book, The Little Prince, that which is most essential is invisible. This was the fox talking to the kid and the guy in the desert. And that for sustainability, that which is potentially most important seems really hard to measure. So that seems like a grand
we
challenge.
don't think about it at all. We don't, it's not in the models, as you guys know better than me. But it's something that we have to measure, particularly when there are these global calls for activism. There's going to be another climate strike, another Fridays for Future global strike on September 24th. But what does it actually mean? And, there's all these claims about the effectiveness of protest and activism, but we need to think about, just because you're successful in getting, somebody who you expect to be a climate champion elected doesn't actually mean that it has any effect, on climate change. It doesn't mitigate or adapt at all. So
I know, Ed, I know you both probably have questions because you examine these big history questions, Paul, and the social element. But I've got to ask you, is this something that activists fear? Do they not want to hear the results?
Ooh, Paul's nodding. That's a good question. So far, I actually don't. I think that mostly I've gotten pushback on the ways that I'm understanding these coalitions of activists that are involved, rather than there being pushback about not wanting to be measured in this way. So far I haven't heard that. I honestly am not sure that this conversation and this question has really gotten out into the general public yet. I think everybody just thinks you get a lot of people in the street yelling, maybe put a pink hat on them and it'll make a difference, right?
So Ed, you obviously had a burning question.
Yeah, Dana, it's nice to meet you. And this is fascinating, and it's relevant to me, not just as an IPCC author, but actually the academic unit I run. We have everything from folks who take a very activist stance on stuff to folks who take very institutionalist stances on how to bring about. Everyone's interested in change, right? But they're coming from that whole range. And one of my big arguments to everybody is there isn't a right approach, right? That you got to line up all of these things. So one of the things I'm interested in just hearing from you is there's so many variables you must be trying to control for, right? You could have a brilliantly conceived protest movement, but they're aimed at the wrong institutional thing. And pulling that lever doesn't actually do anything. And so, how do you control for all of that? Because that strikes me as almost boggling.
Oh, yeah. You try your best, right? I wear 2 hats. I do work in the climate world. I do work in the social movements world and the kind of political world. So I think about this from 2 different sides. There's no question that thinking through targets and tactics and timetables and organizational forms of activism, be they, local community groups or professionalized national, 350 type organizations, matters a lot. And then there's also the way it actually plays out. If you organize a huge protest and a bunch, and all these activists come in nasty diesel buses to Washington, D.C., and then, as tends to get on in the media, leave a whole bunch of trash behind, which always, that's the most common thing to talk about after the protest. What does that mean for climate change? Does it weigh out? So basically, I'm starting from almost zero, not quite zero. There's been some really descriptive work that looks at the relationship between protests and bills as well as pushback. Leah Stokes has some really interesting work on pushback, and basically the counter effects of activism in some ways, where you end up with conservative efforts that that then stop climate progress because of activism. So there's really, so they're both sides of this. So the answer is, I don't know yet, but what I'm hoping to do is, I have a small bit of funding from the USDA, and we actually have a call later today to start to try to bring together what I'm hoping will be a dream team of folks who can help me start to think about how we're going to measure all of these variables. So, but it's a huge lift, right? And but we need to do this work. I think it's just as important as modeling the fossil fuel transition.
There's a guy, Gary Belkin in New York. Sorry, Paul. Gary Belkin is a former mental health commissioner in New York, who's pulling together a coalition around what he calls the social climate, mostly of healthcare practitioners, mental health, from the mental health stress aspects of it. But that word, that phrase, the social climate, feels like such a powerful way to think about that aspect that Ed works on, and you were talking about, both in terms of the mitigation activism and in terms of vulnerability activism. But Paul, I'm sorry, I kind of stepped on you there. Paul, would you?
No, Dana, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I love what you're trying to do. I'm curious about whether you're, what is it that you're trying to measure? The effect of the protests on policy, or is it the effect of the protests on the protesters and their maybe on their opponents? Because one of the big questions that people always have about this area is, what does it mean for me as an individual? And I think there's a kind of dangerous place there where the whole issue can be pushed onto individual behavior, when really the most important aspects of it are all about infrastructure and big systems that have to be changed at the system scale and not at the individual scale. But there is still a role for individuals. But anyway, I'd be curious to hear how you're thinking about that.
Well, so as I talk about in the piece that Andy just had up, I talk about the ways that when we think about social movements, but I think more broadly civic engagement, and social movements is just one way that citizens engage, right? But when we think about that, there are many different ways of having an effect, right? And some of them are direct effects, right? And I review the literature on lifestyle change, going vegan. I talk about the fact that is only a very small part of being able to think about a transition that will be effective to meet the needs that are required to address the issue. And then I also talk about these more indirect effects, right, in terms of pushing for institutional political change, which is clearly absolutely what's needed, and one of the main things that I've been studying for the past 20 plus years. In other work that I do, I look at this more specific questions about, I change the dependent variable, and I ask about what are the effects on individual people in terms of engaging in politics, engaging in climate work, one of my recent books was on environmental stewardship, specifically studying tree planting initiatives, focusing on the Million Trees Initiative in New York, and finding the ways that planting trees actually played a huge role in people creating narratives for themselves about being more environmentally interested, as well as it actually got them more involved in democracy in a bunch of ways. But in this work that I've been doing for IPCC, not to sound crass, but they don't care about that part. They only care about the climate aspect, right? And if we're thinking about the climate aspect, as you say, rightfully, this is all about institutional large-scale change that's needed for us to meet the demands or meet the crisis head on. And if you're talking about that, then we really need to be thinking about what is the effect of the more indirect levers that citizens use to affect change around climate, which is going through economic sector in some ways by pushing for, divestment, for example. There's very little that's been written about the carbon effects of the divestment movement, but it needs to be done. And then at the same time, also the indirect channels that are used to change what's going on in politics in terms of, what can activists do that will have an effect on, infrastructure. And not only infrastructure in terms of a policy in place, but the implementation of it that then yields actual carbon reductions. So it's maybe something I'm going to do for the next 20 years, maybe more. I don't know. Hopefully there'll be lots of other people who want to join me on this quest, because it's a huge task.
Can I just offer one idea? Maybe the disaster risk community has done so much work on coming up with systems models for how things change or don't change. I've been going back to this Ben Wisner graphic. Let me just show you. This is really cool. Came up on Twitter the other day. I think you all are actively in the category of people who see the upside of Twitter amid all the dark side of it. Let me just show you this. And it's a pressure model. Where do I share? Oh, wait. Hold on. Just give me a second. Share. Here we share screen. Whoops, what's going on here? Give me 1 second. I'm getting there. It's been a lot of days with not a lot of sleep for all of you, I'm sure. Share. Here we go. So this model has been around for a long time, and we think of disasters as events, flood, fire, and this is one of these really cool. So the progression of vulnerability, root causes, dynamic pressures, unsafe conditions, and the hazard over here, which of course climate change is changing some of these hazards, flood and fire for sure. But then there's a pressure model for the release model. This is like, how do you reduce pressure? And it's address root causes. And most of the root causes here: poverty, wealth imbalance, resources, ideology, militarism. They're the same as the things we're talking about for climate. And I think if you look at development, even the SDGs, if they have, someone's probably done this for the SDGs too. They're not like specific, discrete things. There are some that are like that, like water filters to get cholera out, but that doesn't get to the source of the cholera. Anyway, this model, this idea of pressure what's building pressure and what's releasing pressure for those most at risk feels so applicable to how you describe the social components of both climate vulnerability and inertia around energy. I don't know if anyone has done something like this for sort of climate and the mitigation side of the energy policy question, but it would be interesting. Does this make sense, or is it kind of silly?
No, I think that without wading into what Working Group 2 is talking about, because we're not out in public yet, but I can talk about my own work. No, this is an active conversation. And actually, since the government approved outlines are sitting out there, it's fair to say that I'm a lead author of Chapter 18, which is titled Climate Resilient Development Pathways. And it's really starting to engage the issue. Actually, there's an interesting debate, Andy, floating around right now. So I work at the intersection of development and climate change. That's been my career. And there's a real question of what is the difference between adaptation work and just good development in the Anthropocene? And there's some questions there. I mean, I would argue they are not exactly the same thing, but they have a lot of things in common. And you're kind of the PAR model you have up here kind of shows how some of those things could be basically the same or very similar. It does create some interesting, and I mean, I'm just speaking from the lit here, the lit on adaptation, the lit on climate change vulnerability over the last 15 years has increasingly really emphasized the social determinants of vulnerability. And so addressing, it makes it challenging for the IPCC. But by the way, people have to remember what the IPCC, the reports are for. I even saw in some of the comments, people forget the reason we do these is because these are the fundamental baseline negotiating documents for all the climate negotiations. This is the agreed set of facts that all the countries have to come to the table with. That's why it gets negotiated. It doesn't have any other official purpose. The official purpose is that. That's why we have to write it the way we do. That's also, it's brutally cited. The whole thing gets negotiated. Because for the next 7 years, any climate negotiation, everyone has to go back to these facts to start negotiating. So that's how it affects policy. And I think we have to think about that as well. We're just pulling this all together here.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to put that out there too, that we have to be very clear about what this does. And so for example, with Dana's work, her work isn't going into this to feed how do we bring about change. It's what do we know about bringing about change, right, and what would that mean for negotiations? It's kind of interesting. It would actually, on that one, it would sort of, it's a weird fit, Dana, actually, some of your stuff. It would sort of lurk, right? It would sort of lurk for some of these governments to go, right, do more protests at home lead to outcomes as we're negotiating? We're actually looking at the data on whether or not people yelling at us at home matters. That's a weird little recursive loop, I'm realizing.
I kind of think that it's also seen as a threat, you know? I frequently I'm asked to weigh in on the degree to which the threat matters.
So hold on 1 second, because my old friend Seth Bornstein, who's the AP's lead climate writer, I encouraged some journalists to maybe pop in and ask a question, and here he is. Seth, have you gotten any sleep the last in your lifetime? Actually, I mean, as an Associated Press reporter, I don't know how you get any sleep, frankly. But anyway, it's good to have you here.
Thank you, and forgive me because I've been working a breaking story about European potential, but probably unlikely, your all-time European heat record being broken today of almost 120 degrees in Sicily. But it's looking kind of suspicious.
And do you have an editor? Do you have an editor saying, like, why is this news? Just another broken record?
Oh, no, actually, no, I'm saying, she's going, can we news alert to this? And I'm going, yeah, let me double check this. And I just got off the phone with the head of the WMO, the rapporteur for climate extremes for the WMO. I love the title.
That is quite a title.
And he's basically saying, this is pretty suspicious, but we are looking into it and we'll see what we find. So, you know, I'm saying this is not worth a story on its own, but mention in a story.
So what we're mainly discussing here is, like, how do we make the IPCC meaningful and impactful and efficacious with this weird 3-group structure, 4-report structure every 5 years, and also integrating the social and climate elements better. So I don't know what comes to mind from you as a reporter.
Well, I often wonder, and I do ask the IPCC this every few years, you know, what's the reason anymore for Working Group 1, which is the one that just issued the report? It's designed to say, here's what we know about the science. And basically what they did this year is sort of hegemonically take a little bit of the impacts from Working Group 2 and then a little bit of the mitigation issues from Working Group 3. And it feels like they're trying to find a reason to exist. Because, as Andy, as you know, going back to 1990, the issue was, how is climate change real? Is it man-made? And each succeeding report, they've gotten more. The language has gotten stronger to the point where you wonder how much stronger they can get. And that comes to my one question for you guys: is in the drafts of the report, and actually in the chapters, so I was able to use it in a write-through of my story, it calls human influence on climate change an established fact. But when it went through the IPCC plenary process, where 190 nations edited it word by word, and it suddenly went from an established fact to unequivocal. And when I asked IPCC about that, I sort of got yelled at because I shouldn't have the draft copy. Well, excuse me.
Oh, that.
Does that matter? And is it only just, people like me and maybe Andy who care? Or is there a big difference between something like unequivocal and established fact?
Well, Seth, let me clue you in that phrase is still in the report. It's just not in the summary for policy.
And I moved it into my story, but it is not in the summary for policymakers.
But that would be a typical effect of the government stage of review, where they will want to be as conservative as possible about it. And, really anything we would call established fact in science is always still, in some sense, temporary. And once in a while, you get a new result that overturns something everyone believed for 100 years. It's very uncommon now because there's so many scientists and so much scrutiny of results. And that's why I think it's justified to call it an established fact. But the difference between unequivocal and established fact is a very thin line. It's it's like the 99.5% probability versus 100%, which you never reach. So I would just put it that way.
Okay, because I was just wondering, that was me. And then my other question for you all is the and this was also watered down from the original draft, is even though every scenario does not hits at least 1.5 and 1.6 even, then comes back down, overshoot. The leaders from Guterres down keep saying we can still reach keep it to 1.5. And I look at it and saying, what report are you reading? And the report itself was watered down to the point where at one point it said this is happening a decade faster than in we said in the 2018 SR 1.5 report. And then they said, oh no, if you looked in another chapter, we had this early of a date. What does it do when they keep up hope for something that really doesn't exist?
Well, Paul, hold on a second.
Well, I think that's
okay.
I think that's a good question, and something that we all have to think about, because that is there because it was we were just talking about this before you came on. The purpose of these reports is to inform the UN climate negotiators. That's what they're for, and they asked for what would it take to reach a target of 1.5 C. That was I was there at the Paris meeting, and there was a very emotional calls from the the small island states and the others that are most concerned about climate change to keep that goal in the report. In the Paris Agreement. So it's there, and we were asked, how do you could you reach that, and how would you do it? So the prospect is, it's theoretically possible. Your question is it really possible in the real world? And I think the answer to that is probably no. It's just it takes such a level of organization and intervention and money that it's just probably not in the cards.
And also that circles back to the fragmentation of the three reports. In other words, the people who could come closest to answering that question are the social scientists, not the climate scientists. That's about social response. And it's about the power of industry. It's about infrastructural realities. The energy wonks get into this case too. How do you decarbonize suburbia if we spend 100 years building it? How do you bring in geoengineering as your way to stop warming? If your question is stopping warming as opposed to stopping vulnerability, do you just tamp down the climate? By the way, one thing that's in this report that's really interesting in that context is that more clearly than the last reports, for sure, Working Group 1 has shown the power of aerosols to damp global warming. And there's work now showing that the rise in hurricane activity in the Atlantic in the last 50 years, the last 30 years, is much more a function of lowering sooty pollution than the rise in CO2 so far. So that's something, but again, getting to the, is the question here on the floor stopping global warming or building a safer human relationship with the climate? And then how do you get that done? Which is Dana's really important research going forward on activism for what? And that's why I hope, while these formal releases have this weird truncated behavior, over a year or more, and then they're all tuned to these climate treaty talks, I hope we can have as much conversation about this as possible to break down some of these barriers, to make sure that the pressure model for disaster risk reduction can be applied to these other social problems. And last thing, Dana, I'd like to hear from you a little bit more on this. And Seth, if you have to go.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I do.
Hang in there. You do, you know. I can't know. I was a reporter for a long time.
Yes.
And I don't know how you do what you do.
Are you kidding? I follow your footsteps. That's all I do.
Oh God! All right. The group hug. No, but
Andy, I've got to have to jump off too. I'm actually supposed to have a call with some of your Earth Institute colleagues, so they're going to find you and get annoyed if I don't.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Ed Carr. Thank you, Seth Bornstein.
And Dana, it's good to finally see you. We've talked.
I feel like we saw each other around Copenhagen, Seth. I think somewhere in there.
Oh, okay.
But,
well, Copenhagen is a blur that I try to forget. Sure. My only happy memory of Copenhagen was watching Andy close his laptop, put his feet up, and say, I'm no longer working at the Times, and I don't have to do this anymore.
That was that was the last day of my job.
I remember it. Well, I was so jealous.
I wish there was a picture of me from that.
Yeah, I should have taken.
Well, thank you again, Seth and Ed. And Ed, much more to come on vulnerability reduction. I've already done shows here with Diana Liverman, others. Yeah. It's a big fixation of mine. But Dana and Paul, if you could stay on for another couple of minutes, we can examine a couple of audience questions that have come in.
Sure.
All right. See you all.
Bye,
hey, thanks, Ed. Well, this has been great. So there was one. Yeah, so Dana, you're working group 3, but this Angela Fay was saying, I think this would apply to you too. Can't working group 2 get a preliminary report out before COP26? Is there a way for
actually? Oh, I was sorry.
Nope.
I was just going to say so. There's been a lot of discussion about this on Twitter, and about the fact that my report comes out. Our report comes out in March, which obviously is well after COP26. I have to say that, a lot of my other previous research, where I actually ended up talking with Bob Watson back at COP6 about what was the point of IPCC and the effectiveness of IPCC in terms of consensus science towards pushing policymaking forward. And, he specifically said to me, science is necessary, but insufficient for what's needed here. And I'm not sure that what we write, I think it's important, but I'm not sure that what's in the final report is really going to change what's going to happen in Glasgow.
Well, that's all part of that efficacy question. And, we all think there's no time, but this is a long journey still. And so the work you're going to be doing going forward, Dana, is as valuable, if not more so, as the work you've been doing so far. So it's really great to have you here. There was another question here from Harlem. Where is it? And Paul, you can weigh in on that one too. But here's Kami Sethi from Harlem. Working in a nearby community in Harlem, I'm constantly wondering how to educate local communities. Protests only achieve so much. So what comes to mind there in terms of the role of the IPCC? Is it all for policymakers, or is there some other way to get traction?
Big questions. Just on the previous one about COP26, of course, the whole IPCC process was massively disrupted by COVID-19, and the original schedule was going to be several months earlier. And I think it's actually an amazing achievement to get it done as fast as we did under the circumstances. So that's, inevitable. And I guess COP26 is proceeding on schedule. So we're behind the timeline. Boy, how to educate local communities. That's really a big challenge. The thing that I always focus on is, individual behavior change can help, and every single pound of carbon dioxide will matter. So there is some value in teaching people about what behaviors they have that they can change, and maybe that's empowering for some people. The downside of it is it also kind of creates a virtue signaling problem where people will begin to think of themselves as doing everything they can to solve this issue that's really much bigger than them, that they can, even the biggest changes you can make will probably change your carbon footprint by 20%, maybe at the most, except for travel, right, which is very, very big. Now, about organizing for larger scale changes, I think there's really a lot that can happen. And now I'm talking as a, not as an IPCC author, but as a kind of person who's been following this issue for many years and a citizen and a policy analyst. There's so much that can be done at the level of buildings and firms and cities. So focusing on the places that you can actually influence can have real value. San Francisco, my city, is really looking seriously at carbon neutrality in the not distant future and how to achieve that and the very large investments that would be necessary. So, activism has provoked that here. I don't know how to draw the causal line, but it's definitely something that wouldn't have happened without it, I could say. So I'm curious what Dana has to say on this.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think those are really good points that you're making. What I would just say is that one of the things, my recent book, which came out in 2019, is called American Resistance. And it was actually a pause from the work I was doing on elite policymaking around climate change when there was very little happening here in the United States, and a focus more on what was happening in the streets, because, as you know, this huge resistance emerged and large-scale protests became commonplace here in the United States. And one of the things I learned from that research was that the way that we think about activism and protests historically is really different from the way it works today. The way it works today is that people come out and get involved in protests, which tends to be digitally coordinated, tends to be the first step for many people in putting themselves on a pathway towards engagement and towards activism. And basically, I tracked all these people who got involved in the resistance, starting at the Women's March, but going all the way through People's Climate March that took place in 2017, and even more recently looking at the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. And one of the most notable things was that when you ask people what the top issues are that they're concerned about today, in the top 3 is climate change. And this is across, doesn't matter what protest people are participating in on the left, it's climate change. And the number 2 thing that I think is really valuable here is when I ask people about the types of engagement they're involved in, they basically talk about channeling their concern into electoral politics. And I think what Paul was saying a minute ago is really important here. So electoral politics is a really important lever that citizens can use and don't use nearly enough to make social change of all sorts. But if you think about this, not just in terms of voting for a president, but voting for, community boards and elected officials at the city level, all the way up the ballot until you hit the president, that is where social change really can happen. And when you think about the climate, that is where we can see people having an effect. That's one of the reasons that Sunrise, which is probably the largest group that's coordinating young people, or at least the most notable one in the United States, is starting to field their own candidates, because they feel like it's better to field candidates who are pro-climate in the way that they think is important, rather than trying to find people and shifting their opinions once they're elected.
There's a lot there. And I think way back in 2006, I wrote an article called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet. That was when Al Gore's movie had come out, and the right wing and fossil fuel interests got really active in challenging the whole narrative. One thing that had come out at that time, in 2006, Dan Abbasi, who was then at Yale at the Forestry School, wrote this book, Americans and Climate Change. And what he was proposing at a meeting to a bunch of environmental groups was to bring the adaptation side into the activism, to make vulnerability reduction part of the narrative for activism, because then that can lead to more buy-in. These communities, we just did a session here last week with Catherine Sutherland, who studies Durban's informal settlements, which are all in floodplains or on steep slopes. And that community doesn't really give a hoot about climate policy. They give a hoot about vulnerability reduction. So you don't want to cut them out of the loop either.
Well, that's one of the reasons that a lot of activists have shifted towards including frontline communities, as well as communities of color, and questions of environmental justice, as well as racial justice and equity broadly defined into their goals. And it has been a really effective coordination tool for expanding the coalition in really meaningful ways, I think.
Great. Just a couple last things. I know you got lots to do. Karen Malpede, who's a playwright whose work I've written about twice. She's written 2 climate plays. She's a feminist eco activist for a long time, using the pen or the computer keyboard to write very provocative plays. She says, Dana, as an eco playwright, I would ask you to consider the role of art in changing consciousness and activism as well. And I know you do, and that's definitely part of the ethos of activism.
I did an event at Columbia last spring, which unfortunately was supposed to be in person, that specifically was around art. So but I think Karen's point is really important. So yes, definitely have to keep thinking about that.
And Karen, I'll get you back on here soon. We'll do more shows on the impact of arts. Some of the coolest art I've seen is actually, the art is active. Stacy Levy is a sculptor and a landscape designer in Pennsylvania who has done these floating assemblages of wetland plants. They're floating. They look like that old Robert Smithson thing down in Great Salt Lake. They're called spiral wetlands, and they remediate the nutrient overload in the ponds. So it's art and active in a different way at the same time. This has been a great, I'm so grateful to you, Paul Edwards and Dana Fisher, and earlier Ed Carr, and Jan Pascal from video earlier, for being on the show today. The last point a reader made, and Maurizio is someone who he and I have done battle sometimes on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere. He's a skeptic on some aspects of things, but he says here, 30 years later, and a lot of reports and fights, maybe the time has come to restart and name the IPCC minus the government influence. And without obsessing on change, we need to adapt and mitigate the extremes. Now, we need to do all of it. That's where we differ. We need to mitigate these emissions, or we have a changed planet at that vast scale that Paul has written about in his book. And at the same time, we need to mitigate risk. So mitigate emissions and risk. And I don't know, but there is this sense. I actually tweeted more than once about this. I'll just show you. I'll get rid of that. To my mind, would we have been better off if back in 1988 the IPCC had been an IPCR, meaning an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Risk, in which climate change is one of the drivers of risk, along with social change. If we stay fossilized, that adds risk through the unerring rise of temperatures, et cetera. If we create a more equitable, vulnerable, resilient society, that changes things. So I still kind of think there's some merit to this idea. I know the history. I know why it started with climate change, but I don't know if that sort of resonates. The last word for both of you, maybe Paul and then Dana, and then we'll let you go.
Well, yeah. This is kind of a big point to end on, but I think I'll do it anyway. I think part of what's happened in this history is that the IPCC was formed by some of the same people who had done the ozone depletion issue just a couple of years earlier. Right. And that was such a successful negotiation that has really saved the planet from extremely dangerous ozone depletion. So they thought that they would do the same process and get to the same place, which is a massive international agreement from the top that would govern all this. And it just hasn't worked to do that process. So, if things had gone the way they hoped, we would have hit that global agreement and reduced emissions back in the 1990s and still be on a downward path. And then we wouldn't be spending trillions of dollars to both adapt and mitigate. And I just, I agree that we have to do both. That, our problem now is that the balance between paying for adaptation and paying for mitigation is changing in favor of paying for adaptation, because that's the nearer term, most local effect that people are concerned about. So we've got to stay on both paths at the same time.
That's a tough one. Dana? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Dana, are you muted?
I was. Sorry, you'd think after a whole year teaching on Zoom, I would be better at that. Sorry about that. I would just say, so I was involved in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was basically formed to be like the IPCC, but it was formed to be an IPCC without government buy-in. And I'll have to say that my experience there and the experience of the people who were involved in that, and there I was a lead author, but the experience was that it was extremely difficult for any of the work in the review that we wrote to be taken seriously or brought into policymakers or put in front of policymakers. So it really didn't get the kind of attention that the IPCC does. And I would just say that, when we think about addressing ozone depletion versus addressing climate change, we're dealing with, apples and then like bowling balls or something. I mean, something,
Exactly.
so much bigger. And I actually talk about that in my first book, National Governance in the Global Climate Change, where I actually talk with Bob Watson and many others who were involved in the IPCC around the building up and development of the Kyoto Protocol. But I think that moving forward, the science is absolutely necessary. I think, though, that we certainly need to consider how the science is structured and is released. I mean, I know that there have been calls for coming out with the social science, or at least, working group 2 and working group 3 is to come out first. And some people were saying that working group 1 should just be like the online supplement. I absolutely don't agree with that. I rather think that we need to go hand in hand, because we're only going to understand the problem and possible solutions by all working together. But I think that means that, by releasing one report before the other, we're really privileging some parts of the science more. And then what we end up with is everybody yelling about, why aren't people talking about activism and advocacy and all the policy instruments that exist and how infrastructure plays a role? And the answer is we do. It just isn't out yet. And it's frustrating because we're going through this, comment period where there's not much more we can say about it. So I think it's a real challenge, but I'm not sure how to address it. I certainly don't think we should get off this path of using science, embracing science, and leading with science.
Yeah. In fact, the show began while you were the dentist with Jan Pascal Isperel, who was the vice chair of the last round, the 5th. So he apparently had been campaigning to be chair of the 6th assessment. And part of his campaign was to make it a 2-part process, with the diagnosis part and a treatment part. And I really like it. So if you review this video later, you'll hear what he said Sunday night. But then, of course, path dependency gets in the way of making those changes. Getting the countries of the world to agree on that would be really hard. It's going to be really hard for them to agree on getting language into the future reports on what you were just going to be digging in on. They also seem to have been excluding some language in one of the upcoming reports related to fossil fuel interests, toxifying the communication climate.
My chapter. So
yes, I'd like to learn more. And one last word, and this is, I hope it's not too depressing, but it just reinforces what Paul and what you just said about the ozone. When I wrote my 1988 cover story on global warming, this is like 5,000 words in 1988, reported from the Toronto meeting on the changing atmosphere, 3 days after Jim Hansen's testimony. There was a section, I get haunted by these things, where Peter Winsemius, who's a Dutch scholar, former minister of the environment, says, don't count on this being like CFCs. He said there are only 38 companies worldwide that produce CFCs. You can put them all in one room. And then he goes on. And so even then, this was not exactly unknown. It was unknown or de-stressed by people who were caught on the idea this is a pollution problem and we got to solve it with regulation and treaties. And that just means there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you again for being here today, both of you. It's great. I hope we think of this as one of a series. Dana, you were on here earlier during the pandemic, and I hope you'll be back. And Paul too. There's lots to talk about related to the deep history of this process too. So thank
Anytime.
you. Anytime.
Really
Thanks
enjoyed
a lot
this.
for having me, Andy.
And for those who are watching, and for you too, this is all immediately archived and shareable on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, and everywhere. So let's keep this all moving. Thanks again. Get some rest.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.